Okay, yeah, good to see you again. Yeah, awesome. All right, hey, how you doing? See you. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Don Chen. I'm the head of the Surdna Foundation. My colleague Tanu is here.
Sorry.
All right, Tanu is our program officer in the Sustainable Environments Program, and we have 4 programs here: Sustainable Environments, Inclusive Economies, Thriving Cultures, and Andrew's Family Fund, which works on youth justice issues. We also have an overlay here at the Foundation on impact investing, which focuses primarily on DEI in the investing field, hiring fund managers of color, and also doing some climate-friendly renewable energy work in the endowment. So that's a little bit about the Surdna Foundation. We're a 106-year-old family foundation, and it's just great to invite you to our space. I see Bria Graham is here as well. Bria is in our Inclusive Economies program, so thanks for being here. Okay, so it is my delight to welcome Nonprofit Quarterly, all of you all who are here. This is the Movement Economies panel discussion. I was just admiring this, which I haven't read yet, but we have tons of copies and you can take it, right? And we'll be saying more about that later. And I'm also going to hold this up, one of the many products that NPQ is putting out. And I want to mention a couple things about Surdna and our relationship with Nonprofit Quarterly. When I got to the Surdna Foundation 5 years ago, I really wanted to make sure that we were focusing on narrative change, because I believe that narrative change is incredibly powerful. It is a battle that so many folks, are in the midst of, but a lot of us, in the world of social change and progressivism, don't even realize that we're in it. And so, we need to wake ourselves up, recognize the power of the cultural power, the power of narrative change, and really make sure that we're deploying tools and organizing ability to that work. So Nonprofit Quarterly has been a place where movement leaders, where leading thinkers, leading actors, activists who are on the front lines have come together to share their thoughts. One of our colleagues, Robert Smith, likes to say that this is the place to be. Like, if you're in Nonprofit Quarterly, you're sharing ideas with the community for movement building and really making things happen. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, you all call it journalistic organizing, which I think is a good term. To me, it speaks to the organizing of ideas and the people behind them. That is so important. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm delighted that we're a supporter, and I'm going to hand it over to Rithika and Steve. We're going to talk about the economic justice work here at MPQ. All right.
Thanks everyone for coming to Nonprofit Quarterly's Movement Economies event, generously hosted here in the Surdna Foundation's beautiful space. We want to gratefully acknowledge the financial support provided by some of the folks in this room, including Surdna, of course, Humanity United, Rockefeller Brothers, and we hope that others of you that are here will join them in funding our work. My name is Rithika Ramamurthy, and I'm Economic Justice Editor at Nonprofit Quarterly, along with my co-host of today's event, Steve Dubb. We've invited you all here today to open conversation around the summer 2023 Economic Justice magazine issue, Movement Economies, Making Our Vision a Collective Reality. I'm going to speak briefly about what we mean when we say movement economies, why we feel like this is an important conversation to have now, and what we hope it contributes to the field. Every year, NPQ's Economic Justice Test surveys the field. We speak to movement leaders, we study the political landscape affecting economic justice movement groups. We work with voices in the field to produce hundreds of articles and webinars a year on everything from organizations promoting Black food sovereignty, to worker cooperatives, to economic policy failures around student debt, to indigenous movement for land reparations, to unions in the workplace. Our scope is as wide as the US economy, which is to say it is as wide as the system of production that affects everyone living and working in it. Last year, it struck us that perhaps this scope was exactly what we needed to focus on for our summer magazine issue. What if what we need to talk about most is exactly the promises and challenges of building a more just and democratic system when the problems, solutions, and contradictions are so varied and uneven for so many? Building a democratic economy, Steve and I note in our introduction to the issue, requires three things: that people understand the problems of the current economic structure, that we propose democratic alternatives, and that we organize to make those ideas a reality. Seems easy, right? MPQ has noted that the struggle for an economy that works for everyone is a practical one, and that it will not happen without social movements building and exercising power. In short, and I quote, we need movement economies, that is, democratic economic structures that social movements understand to be in their interests and worth fighting for. And even though we are living in a moment where we are watching people make important gains, fighting gentrification in their cities, pushing for progressive climate policies in their schools, advocating for reallocation of resources to achieve racial equity, and going on strike against major corporations in order to redistribute wealth away from CEOs back towards the working class, there is still work to do to bridge the gap between social movements and the reality of economic justice. First, let's name some of the main opponents and obstacles to the cohesive vision of a democratic economy. Since the late 1970s, the economic and political forces of neoliberalism have led to our current conditions of exponential economic inequality. This was achieved by a concerted political attack on unions, intentional attrition of the social safety net, deregulation of the economy, and maximization of corporate profits. Over the past 50 years, capitalism has worked overtime to concentrate wealth, income, and resources to those who own capital, polarizing the economy to unprecedented levels of inequality. In 2021, the top 1% of Americans held more wealth than the bottom 90% in total. When you add race into the equation, the numbers reach bleaker levels. In 2014, the New York Times reported the black-white ratio of wages was almost the same as in 1950. As we know, this story of the economy and its growing corporate hegemony had a brief interlude in the civil rights era of the 1960s, when Black Americans began to have access to union jobs, higher education, and other economic opportunities promising class mobility. When these vehicles for social uplift began to be dismantled for everyone in the era of neoliberalism, both the racial wage gap and wealth inequality began widening again. Today, the gigification of the economy, mass incarceration, and myriad social and political forces support a racial capitalist system which divides us and depresses human flourishing and solidarity. What this summer's issue poses, however, is that the fact that social movements in the U.S. are born and bred in the social context of racialized division, class struggle, and growing poverty are getting more sophisticated. In recent years, the tide has been turning, orienting organizations towards understanding that liberation can only happen if social movements are expansive enough to take on inequality at critical points of intersection. The movement economies issue tries to map and uplift efforts to transform the social movement field in this way. Another part of the story in this issue is what we call the nonprofit double bind. Attending the dissolution of the social safety net, the nonprofit sector has often served as a stopgap for the failures of social provision at the governmental level. Not only have many nonprofits flourished as social programs and as unions decline, but the sector itself is a large piece of the economy today, employing almost 10% of the workforce and generating over $2 trillion in revenue. But its growth has hardly brought about an end to the social injustices it attempts to address. So, what is to be done? Today's conversation is not only about the difficulties of overcoming oppressive social forces, making movements talk to each other, and acknowledging the inherent contradictions in the nonprofit field that both promote and prevent social change. It is about strategic interventions to promote solidarity both between groups and as a fundamental principle of nonprofit organizations moving forward. We think that agreement about this direction as a minimum, a willingness to connect points of critique, work to align struggle, and build capacious movements is key to achieving not only structural economic change, but liberation in other forms. This issue featured movement leaders discussing why working at the nexus of the climate crisis and inequality has produced transformative Green New Deal policies at the state level, how understanding racial capitalism is the key to both combating both inequality and racism at the same time, how worker movements centering racial justice have been able to advance bigger and better and more capacious movements, and why democratically run organizations are often the most successful at advancing democracy in the world. Today, we are delighted to have the conversation of where we go from here and what we need to do it. So without further ado, I will pass it on to my coworker, Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice. Thank you.
Thanks, Rithika. So I'll say a few words and then we'll get the panel up here. And then our hope is to actually have a conversation. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. But one thing I do want to say is, this is, social change is a team sport. So I want to first introduce Cindy Suarez, our editor-in-chief, and her daughter Safia Suarez, who's also the leader of the Edge video. Did I get that right? Edge Studios, sorry. So done a lot of interesting short form video. And there's a lot of people behind this. So like the artwork here, the Devin Taylor's our creative director, Cassandra Helixer's the editor of the magazine, and there's a whole digital team too. So it looks like it's all Rithika and me, but it's actually a big team. So I want to thank everyone. It's nice to have people come, like Alpha Demolish, who I knew from, we were in a cohort of something called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, is now Common Future. What was that, like 10 years ago almost now? Yeah. And she leads something called Rising Tide Capital. Who else? Adria Powell over there is from Cooperative Home Care Associates. So that's the some of you know this, the largest worker cooperative in the United States is based here in New York City, in the Bronx, I guess specifically. Sean Buffington, I want to acknowledge from Henry Luce. This book was supported by both Surdna helped subsidize the publishing, and Henry Luce supported the stipends for the writers, and it wouldn't have happened without them. So thank you. Of course, thanks to our hosts at the Surdna Foundation, who made this event possible. I have to say, it's just nice to be in a room with people as opposed to in front of a computer screen. So really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm sure I'm leaving out people I should thank and what have you, but I want to bring up the panel now. A couple of things just to say, there's like a one-pager on MEQ and it's both sides. There's the magazines, so make sure to take one of those. And if anybody wants our actual funding proposal, I did bring a few copies just in case you did. And of course, we would appreciate support from anybody who is interested in what we're trying to do. So with that, let me bring up to our panel Esteban Kelly from the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, Emily Kawano from the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and Wellspring Cooperative, and José Garcia from the Future Workers Program at the Ford Foundation. And we'll get started. A few questions and we'll take yours.
Where are you and where are we?
Why don't I be on this side, I guess. Does that work? You guys can fight over the order. We did not plan an order, so.
It's not fair for short people.
Oh, you have amazing shoes.
I have amazing shoes.
And we have mics if we want them. Do we want mics? Okay, so I will do that. All right, here we go with the mics. All right, well, I just wanted to start, I think, with talking about some of the articles. So both Emily and Esteban were authors of in that issue. And Emily, we'll start with you and maybe talk a little bit about what is the solidarity economy anyway, and then talk about your article and then the transition that different organizations are doing across the United States.
Do I get to use my slide?
You do. It's up there. So yeah.
Oh,
Lay out the way.
So I did want to start with the definition of the solidarity economy. So this is coming both from the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network as well as RIPES. RIPES is the International Solidarity Economy. And RIPES went through a 2-year international process of consultation to at least get sort of a common groundwork of agreement. And so this is what we have. So it's solidarity economy is a number of things. It is it's a framework. And you can't hear me?
We're just recording the audio.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm gonna look at the slide. Okay. So yeah, number one, it's a framework. It is a framework that connects practices and people that are aligned with solidarity economy values. So the values will look different in different places, but in the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, we use 5. Solidarity, democracy, so participatory democracy, equity in all dimensions, race, class, gender, etc., sustainability, and pluralism means it's not a one-size-fits-all model. Right? There are many paths to the same goal. And all of this is articulating a post-capitalist world, which is very important. Solidarity economy is very clear that about believing that we're not going to get to that more just, sustainable, democratic world through capitalism, by reforming capitalism. Capitalism is going to kill us. We need to move beyond it. So just a few indications of where solidarity economy is. Global movement, RIPES I mentioned, the ILO runs an annual academy on solidarity economy. There's a UN task force on solidarity economy. It's enshrined in 2 national constitutions in Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are a number of countries that have national solidarity economy policy frameworks in support of solidarity economy. So there's a lot of there. There's a lot of legs. It didn't emerge out of the north. Well, it's sort of simultaneously, both Europe as well as, but a lot of the momentum has come from the global south. So I just stop there in terms of the definition, just so that we're all on the same page. So I'll talk a little bit about the article that I wrote, which was the one about organizations that have made this leap from either being single issue organizations, or if they had a more systemic analysis, if they had a more systemic analysis, they were talking about making broad systemic change within the context of capitalism. So they were either single issue, or if they did have a systemic perspective, it was reformist. So I looked at 3 organizations. One was the CBD, not what you're thinking, Center for Biological Diversity. So they do a lot of stuff, right? I would say that they did have a systemic analysis from the get-go, but a few years ago they engaged in a whole process, sort of soul searching, and did come to the conclusion that they needed to grapple with capitalism, and came to the conclusion that they could not really make true progress on their issues without moving beyond capitalism. Inherently, intrinsically, unavoidably, capitalism is not sustainable. So that's that organization. The second one was it's called Marble Seed, used to be Moses, Organic Farmers in the Midwest. Came to the same conclusion. They were a single issue organization, right? Organic farmers. They moved towards understanding we really need to think about the whole system, and we need to think about moving beyond capitalism and embrace solidarity economy. My organization, Wellspring Cooperative in Springfield, Massachusetts area, we do co-op development. That we started off as a single issue organization of developing worker co-ops in Springfield's underserved communities, which is mostly Springfield and Holyoke. And over time, we have broadened out, we broadened our mission. So we also now do solidarity economy work. And what led us there was also, like the other organizations, just the reality of our work. Many of our workers live in precarity, and even if, like, I can't say that am I on time? Sorry. Okay, so anyway, we made that shift as well from single issue to really looking at the whole shebang. So I'll stop there.
Great, and Esteban, I'll let you go next and talk about your art.
Sure. I'm gonna bridge from that, so thank you, Emily, for even giving us that hook around just the challenge of the fact that if we what does it mean that we can't get to change within capitalism? Our piece kind of looked at movements who often are really tied up in fighting capitalism and resisting the conditions that that capitalism and racial capitalism in particular has left their communities in, and thinking about what would shift if more of our people got involved in the work of not just resisting the bad but building the new, and that of course has been adopted within a lot of movements. I think most notably the movement for Black Lives, some of the climate justice movements within the last 3 or 4 years, and yet, we've been doing this work for decades at this point, right? So suddenly we're like supposed to be the veterans of this. So one of the things we were noticing is that a lot of the groups who have been so steeped in resistance work have a skepticism about engaging with the state at all, and so we're leaving a lot on the table. So the piece that I wrote, and I actually co-wrote it with our policy director, Mo Mangling, at the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, really started with that premise. Not, hey, everybody, we should all think that policy and advocacy and engaging the state is the way to liberation, but actually, have we overcorrected in the wrong direction by completely being absent from ever meeting with elected officials, or people who work for the government who even aren't elected, right? And talking to movement people, they're just like, oh yeah, I guess there's people in government who aren't even elected. It's like most people aren't elected. So just really engaging with that, like we're leaving way too much on the table. And actually, the premise of our article was, can we just not overthink this a little bit? It's not to say that you need to have a whole sophisticated branch dedicated to understanding all the advocacy, and you need to open up a new lobbying branch or anything, but that C3 organizations can do a certain amount of advocacy, that it doesn't take that much to educate, sit down with people who maybe work for a local workforce development task force or small business development agency, let alone for grassroots organizations, which is a lot of what we talked about. What does it look like for your leadership pipeline to include training up the members of your community, of your constituency, to tell their own stories, right? That too often with the professionalization of movement work, of nonprofit work, it becomes the people who have had media training or who understand all the talking points, when we all know that the real impact comes from hearing people who are actually directly impacted, not just the organizations who represent communities that are directly impacted. So that's a lot of what we explored, and we talked about how we suddenly were able to punch way above our weight, actually by engaging in advocacy work, that in the history of the United States, there had not been a single federal law mentioning worker cooperatives until 2018. And it just kind of all happened. And since then, we've had, on average, about 1 per year. We cheated because we had like 3 last year. But if you can average that in. And then a lot of that came from, I don't even think our policy director is full-time only working on policy and advocacy. She runs our conferences and events and is doing all kinds of other things with our staff. And yet, look at the level of impact we're able to have through convening, through coordination, and the ways in which that work itself helps us to deepen our understanding of what it means to tell our own stories, and beginning to see ourselves as protagonists, right, in this movement story. And we don't do a lot of narrative work at this point in our organizing, but I have been kind of moved by people who do a lot of sophisticated work around narrative, and the extent to which our communities have been, objects and objectified, and what does it look like for us to become subjects, and in the Latin American tradition as to become protagonists in our own stories. So a lot of that is about actually handing the mic to our members, providing not just a one-off training, but a community of practice where they can build support and solidarity, and just the power of what it looks like to have working class Black worker owners tell their stories, immigrant worker owners tell their stories, women who are in the care industry tell their own stories, farm workers tell their own stories in these different settings. And sometimes that is testifying. Sometimes it's just speaking on a panel or something. And sometimes it is, picking up the pen and authoring some sort of op-ed, even if it's something local or something online that might not get wide circulation, that all of those things end up mattering and shaping who our community is. So that's a lot of what we talked about.
Thanks, Esteban. That's great. We invited Jose to be on this panel. Jose was not an author in the magazine, but is not a bad thing.
No, that
But I think we wanted to have an outside view on the issue and what struck you about articles within that issue. So I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much. When you have very long passwords, what happens? That's not helpful in these type of moments. Hello, everybody. My name is José Garcia from the Future Worker at the Ford Foundation. For us, our entry point clearly is worker power, and how do we ensure that workers have dignity at the workplace? I just want to know, that's our kind of world and view. And I'm very excited that NPQ actually, not necessarily that invited me, but invited somebody that can talk about the role of workers as we think about the new economy. Because usually tend to be not necessarily inclusive of the worker movement, right? It talks about workers, but not necessarily about workers, right? And its movement in collective bargaining and power, right? Which I think you guys did an incredible job in that. But I want to cheat, and I want to say, I'm going to comment in the two articles, and because they are all central to the work that we do, right? Our analysis, and I think the analysis of a lot of our groups have to do that we live in a racial capitalist system, right? In which race and honestly gender are used as an important part of the business model. It's not by coincidence setting the article as second, it's actually part of the business model, as is redlining, as is all the different, as is low wage sectors, as is the labor segregation, as is domestic workers not being included in labor negotiation and restaurant workers. Okay, by the way, Chicago just suspended minimum wage today, which is a great win for all workers. So I think we've seen everywhere. I think what I want to add from the article is that these issues of racial capitalism, while clearly centers the United States, it has supply chains that are extended throughout the world, right? Our textures are being used in Asia, right? So we see that also part of our racial capitalism, and how do we ensure that then workers actually can negotiate with capital, right? In different ways. For informal workers to labor unions, which is an important part of the conversation, because with increased precarity, labor being a small part of the organized labor, we have to think of different ways that we can experiment with actually workers being at the center and actually negotiating power, actually changing policy, and actually negotiating directly with employers, right? So I think for us, that's a very important part of the conversation. I really enjoy clearly the different conversation that SACEB actually goes into the base tradition of the labor movement, right? Which is seeing itself not only as a strict negotiation with your wages and benefit, but thinking about the collective bargaining as a bargaining for my life, right? In the 1930s, you have labor unions negotiating taxes, right? In the bargaining for common good that SACEB just mentioned, SACEB the article and work that is ongoing right now, negotiating the issues of teachers, negotiating issues of schools and students, and negotiating clearly the issue of climate change, for example, right? So how do we use, and what I like about it that is highlight, how do we use the different type of power to ensure that we have a different, right, economy, that being collective bargaining, that being policy, that being corporate capture. And I will end with say that the article that passed, which is Smiley's article, is a very exciting article, right? Because it actually talks about the moment. And I think in the labor movement, we are at that moment. We are in the moment that we have writers, right, that just negotiated, but still dealing with, right, with others trying to get their own contracts also in their own unions. You have UPS, right? You have, UAW in the middle of this. You have huge, and the ambition of the labor movement is a different ambition in sectors of the labor movement, right? Where the labor movement is thinking sectorally also, as the bill that passed in California. The labor movement also is thinking about how collectivize, how to ensure, going back to this idea of democracy. We have pieces out labor, thinking of how do we create worker councils as part. That's democracy, right? As part of actually decision making, because labor council allows workers to negotiate, because policy is not a static process, right? It's a consistent contestation in which you have to have the power to ensure that you're part of it, and also you are actually ensure that you can move forward and build more power to ensure that you have what you need for your constituency. So that's, and I think for the reflection for me, labor, as he well said, labor is not just a tool of economic power and democracy, but it's a broader tool of democracy. And I think that jump, and I think we're just talking to one of the people here, that jump to think about labor as an important part of the democratic process is an important pivot that we all have to do in philanthropy, I think. Is, democracy don't only live in people civic engaging themselves, but it lives in decision making of their life. And economy is an important part. We spend how many times of our day, honestly, working in this economy? And I think that possibility of having a decision making of not only of your life, but also of the policies that are put, are fundamental for any democratic project. I will go farther to say that there's no democratic project that didn't have a strong labor union.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to move the conversation. So Rithika and I came up with this term of movement economies, and I think there was somebody who said something like there's no author in the text or what have you. So like the term takes on a life of its own after you create it. So I actually want to hear from each of you what movement economies means to you. And I don't know, whoever wants to go first. Okay.
Gotcha. When I read that chapter, that article, what stuck with me was movement economies is about an economy, an economic reality that social movements can relate to. So social movements are fighting for a whole bunch of things: environmental, racial, gender, you name it, right? Housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a movement economy means like, what is it that will really fulfill what all those movements are trying to achieve? And the conclusion is just reforming capitalism is not going to do the trick. I thought that was a really brave. I just want to applaud NPQ for consistently being willing to critique capitalism. I mean, it's unusual, and I just think it's so brave, and that's one thing that I just love about NPQ. Big delight.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think, for me, this term is completely new. So I am, holding clearly her solidarity economy, new economy term, but I find it very interesting. An organizing term that we use generally is economic democracy. But I can see the connectivity to the idea of movement that is centered movement and as economic actors, right? In all these intersectional ways, and I think it's an important part of what I think labor movement does, right? Like labor movement center its workers as part of a broader system, right? And ensure that then how do we change particular part of the system, right? And that's a very, broad as I suggested in the beginning. But I think I just want to lift up a couple of examples, right? I think, we have the Always Essential campaign that actually got policies that actually have worker council as part of health considerations, right? And this is Harris County, Texas. In addition to that, we have the bargaining for common good. I think is a great example of also movement economies. In addition to that, we also have ABC, an initiative for Job with Justice that is actually creating a cadre of Black strategists, not organizers, strategists. These are people that are calling the shots on each campaign, that are calling the shots for how do we actually going to move in any particular local, right? So we wanted to inject basically the diversity of opinion and the reality of the Black experience as a central part of strategy that I think usually is left out, right? As part of it, when we don't have we don't have Black people actually leading those, or Latinos as part of those processes. And I think it's a critical component to this piece. And of course, I think an important piece to this work that I think I will put in movement economies is the different labor wins that we have seen across the country as part of that. So I can gravitate toward this. I really enjoy the centering of movement as part of that versus, for example, economic democracy that tend to center, I think, the structures, right? It center how we change the economy versus the people that are doing the work. So appreciating the term and how it's used.
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much more to add because I I orient similarly. A lot of our work, it's our mission and everything else is in pursuit of economic democracy. So I have also, it's a new thing to orient to. You've revealed that it's new to all of us. Anyone who's pretending that, oh yeah, I've been talking about this for years. And you're like, well, we made it up 4 months ago. But I do think about it as, that economy is drawing a circle around the larger whole. That it is not, actually to Emily's opening point about the siloing of issues or of nonprofits and the way that those organizational forms had emerged and were constituted, especially in the 1980s and 90s, that actually this is getting us beyond mere intersectionality, but it actually is saying, it's like the blue marble thing, zooming all the way out and taking a picture from the moon and being like, this whole thing is the economy. If we're talking about movement economies, it's everything, that we're part of this massive and extensive circulation of commodities that envelops the planet, and that it's not just about the consumption patterns there, but about production, to José's point. So that we are all connected, whether that's around food and that productive work, all the way through to the composting and the recycling and the waste workers that are part of our some of our members in worker cooperatives. And that it goes actually beyond mere just businesses, that it also includes things that are informal, that are part of the gift economy, gig economies, babysitting, like all of the things that don't always necessarily get captured and registered by what we think of as the economy, down the street, way down the street, where I'm pointing, right? And that actually the concept of not just economic democracy, but the vision of abolition democracy, right, as the sort of anecdote or the inverse of racial capitalism, that we're getting toward the abolition of those structured and entrenched systemic oppression of people of color and extraction from people of color, by centering what is it that our communities need to be healthy, to be whole, to be well, to be in solidarity and in support of one another, and that it recenters that social relationship, including ones that aren't social in terms of we all know each other, but that we are connected through the circulation of commodities and our hands in production and consumption of them.
Thanks. And so I think I'll ask one more question and then we'll throw it to the audience and look forward to your questions. But, this is sort of an iterative process, right? So, we did an issue on solidarity economy, we did one on ownership, we did one on movement economies. More importantly than the issues, there's just the movement itself, right? And our discussion about where do we need to be going as movements to advance economic justice and system change. So where would you like to see the conversation turn next? What are we not talking about that we need to talk about? And maybe you can jump into that. Maybe I'll go to you, Esteban, first.
Sure.
Just to switch it up.
Just to switch it up. I think it's encouraging that there is more acceptance and more of an embrace on the vision and on the sort of rhetoric around economic democracy. Like there's a warming to that those of us who've been doing this work for a long time find refreshing. But I think where we need to go is way beyond the narrative and the sloganeering and into power, like really thinking pragmatically. And that's a lot of what's explored in this and recent issues, I'll say, not just the one from this summer, but even over the last couple years for NPQ, is looking at what does it look like to not just think of political power, which is a traditional strategy of the left, but to think about economic power. And for us, it has to also be around ownership. So when we think about the cooperative economy, the solidarity economy, it is about owning or stewarding land, practicing democracy, certainly, but even the idea of seeding business to business is for the capitalists. And so we're just going to be out here with our signs on the street. It's like, no, we live in a world where business makes everything move around. And if we're not involved in setting up our own businesses, in setting standards for high road employers, like what does it look like to be the innovators of the high wage way to do certain kinds of work, or the sustainable way, like what is the green energy standard, what is the labor standard, what is a feminist, what's a harassment-free workplace standard for your retail spaces that you're running, et cetera, that actually democracy is the ingredient by which we turn structures like businesses, like cooperative businesses, like housing co-ops, land trusts, even institutions like public banks and some of the other visions and projects that a lot of our people have been working on for a while. Democracy is the ingredient to figure out how we actually shape those things, design it to be adaptive and reflective of the needs of the demos, of the people who are impacted by those projects, who own and control it. And then that also becomes a model for, or an ingredient for, the economic power that in and of itself, as we know, shapes political power, right? So how did the corporations get so much power? How did the billionaires get all the power? Well, it's because of the fundamental economic root and basis of their power that then is able to capture the media and discursive power, or to capture research, or news stories, news outlets, and certainly political power. So what I would like to see is for us to build up our own economic power and even have some more sophistication of how we think about that. Obviously, unions are a huge piece of that. But even conceding that, well, there's always going to be an owner of this business that is not us, all we want is a better slice of the pie or better treatment, I think is not actually visionary enough. There is a way of looking at, and we talked about this in our article, non-reformist reforms, like ways of approaching that kind of project that get at a different rewriting of the ingredients of how we produce the political economic system we have. So those are the kinds of things that I would like to see emerge in this work. And it is going to come by having humility to learn from each other, that people who actually already have a very sophisticated understanding of movements and political change need to work with a lot of the people who've been around and involved in economic democracy and solidarity economy work for a long time, but who might not be as sophisticated in that sort of work. So we're here because we sit in that nexus. And I think the more people we have sort of bridging that divide, I think it can catalyze some of the work that needs to happen.
I think I will center power also. I think that the main issue is power asymmetric. So therefore, how do we center power, right? As the main organizing force when we think about restructuring the economy. And there are very concrete ways of doing that, right? It sounds very abstract, but let me just share with you. I think right now we're living in an economic transitions. And I think the economy is always changing, but I feel that there are particular important changes happening right now as we speak, or opportunities that we can think about. I think that the conversation that we're having around the care economy, very important restructuring of an economy that is not only of domestic workers. If you think about and look at the work that is happening in Bogota, that is happening in Nairobi and other parts of the world, it's actually a very comprehensive way of looking at care, basically, of people, full stop, around the world. And I think that's a very visionary way of looking at this. We're also looking at the just transition. I mean, I think we cannot ignore the role of industrial policy in all this. I know there's horrible industrial policy, and actually there is very effective industrial policy. The package that we get, very incentive driven, not the best part of writing industrial policy, but we cannot let that opportunity go away. We have to actually contest for that to ensure not only that we have a good job, but you have public option, and that we have co-ops, right? That we actually diversify in an economy that actually is not rooted in the idea that corporate power have to rule as it usually have. Like, I think we have opportunities there. And the third one, I think the most complicated one of them, is the role of technology. I mean, not only AI, data, and this is something we're seeing already. I mean, this is not the robots are coming tomorrow. I mean, this is happening today. Workers are negotiating. The NFL was negotiating recently biodata with the NFL because it affects their pay. You know, you have workers also negotiating already in Unite Here around, you know, how many people want to take drinks in the floor. That's already happening today. This is not a story of the future. So the organizing in Alabama Black workers organizing in a massive plan, that was surveillance technology that Black workers rise up. So we cannot underestimate the power of technology and how it's affecting workers right now. And I think in the way that we engage in this conversation now, we actually can make a different type of way that we think about technology that actually center workers. I think that particular is a very difficult proposition, but I think if not engaging in that conversation can have that huge detrimental impact throughout all our communities. So I would start
thought. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about a process that USN has been part of. So USN initiated this process that we call Resist and Build. Steve has been very involved in this. And really, it's very similar in a lot of ways to this movement Economies, right? Making the point that the build of solidarity economy, of creating actual concrete alternatives, really needs to be joined up with the resist. And by resist, we mean electoral politics and policy. That's in the second sphere, plus the grassroots organizing. So those are the three spheres. And then I was saying earlier that we added a fourth sphere right in the middle that intersects everything, which is arts, culture, and care. Because it really is who we are as human beings, right? That cultural piece, and arts is so important in building that culture. So I think that solidarity economy has gone from being completely unknown in 2007 when the network formed, to now it's pretty prevalent in progressive circles. And now is the time, I think, that we need to be much more. We have been very organic in growing awareness and making connections, but not very deliberately strategic, because people didn't even know what it was. I think we're at a point now where we really need to be strategic about how do we scale out and up. So it's not just getting bigger, it's making connections. And some of the connections are, like, to riff off what y'all were both saying about how do you build power. And there is a real focus on looking at land, because a lot of stuff starts with land. And if we own land and we can maybe co-locate or use that leverage, say a community land trust model, to build local solidarity economy ecosystems. So we co-locate the affordable housing, the regenerative agriculture, the co-ops, the things that are not businesses, but where communities are producing for themselves. And the tie-into the tech is that we're working with some really innovative, like Fab Lab tech whizzes, who are giving us a glimpse of what the future could be, where you really can decentralize a lot of production. And even a way that you can source materials, inputs locally. I mean, it's mind-blowing, the possibility that we're just on the cusp of. So technology can be a really scary thing and used for really bad ways, but there is this potential that I'm really excited about. So that's some of the work that we're doing, trying to marry all this up, create ecosystems that are a model, right, that could be piloted one place and replicated.
Great, and so now the floor is yours, and hope that I can do should I be doing the Phil Donahue thing and moving the mic? How necessary is the mic for the audio?
Pretty necessary.
Okay, so please raise your hand and okay. All right.
Does this work?
It does.
I'll ask a question. Thank you so much for your remarks. One thing I love about this issue is that it seems like the articles are in dialogue with each other. And Esteban, your article where you talk about public policy and CHIPS and the CARES Act, and you have a message about basically ignore public policy and public dollars at your peril, because otherwise we're leaving power and outcomes on the table, and then
You got Mo Mitchell's piece talking about governing power.
Right.
Why do you feel compelled to write about that at this time?
Yeah, I think part of it is that the people who had mentored me in movements were mostly resistance-based movements, and we had this allergy to those halls of power, whether that was city council, state capital, or federally, and let alone the bureaucratic offices. I mean, there just was there's illiteracy. Like, our movements just don't even know that those things exist, except for their one issue, right? They all know the office of, this food policy thing and this, but not comprehensively. Like, we're talking about the direction our movements need to go. And so then you start building relationships, and people in this room probably know this, but a lot of movement people don't know this. You start building relationships, and it turns out everyone with these evil power brokers, they're like, give me one excuse or one testimony for supporting. All we want to do is do something useful, but none of y'all people are here. So it's all we have are the lobbyists who are giving us a lot of money, and we can't even point and say, oh, but these people really delivered this test. Did you see that on C-SPAN? I couldn't possibly. So some of it was actually realizing that there are a lot of people, especially the staffers, more so, who are more honest with you about what's happening than the politicians themselves, who are more than willing to actually show you the workarounds. We might come up with a whole bunch of movement demands based on what our needs are, but strategically, the opportunities for a few strokes of the pen, there are some small reforms that are not that easy to do, that don't cost that much political capital. So just my experience of having my mind blown at just how easy that was, and just by virtue of paying attention. And it doesn't need to be everyone paying attention, was really the point of the article. It was sometimes you just need part of one person's time, or a couple of volunteer committee members who are gonna read a thing or show up to a thing. You can get a lot done that is in alignment with movement values. So we, of course, the moment you say that, everyone's coming for your head. So we try to balance the piece by saying, and here are all the ways that our members are involved in an endorsements policy, in vetting anything that we advocate for, that's all democratic. There's a way to do this where you're still accountable to your base. So that's why it felt necessary, just realizing how much of that. I thought it was the conclusion to this piece, and I was remembering that it was the last piece, which I co-authored with Melissa Hoover from the Democracy at Work Institute, where we talked about, it was much more speculative and looking at if we win, actually to your last question, if we win, where could this go? But it also looked at, if we lose, where could this go? And if things go wonky in some way, where does this go? And at the conclusion of the piece, we said, look, ultimately, what we need to do is we got to get rid of all of the red tape and all the punishment and all the things that inhibit everything good, everything sustainable. There's 1,000,001 glass ceilings and bureaucratic things that are in the way that are actively punishing the bad things. We have a system that greases the wheels for everything bad. You can build a new prison like that, but try to set up a scalar worker co-op in the health industry, and it's oh my God, you can't get financing, you can't get technical assistance, you can't get. So let's get rid of all the bad things. Then let's set up access to the things that are good and useful. And then once we have all of that, the advantage moving in the favor of movement economies and the things we're doing, then we need to leverage that and deploy the power to actually have the systemic change that we're talking about.
Great discussion. Thank you for all your comments. I'm curious, part of the value of being in this room with articles and ideas that are actually conversing together is very helpful, because I think we're in need of a lot of sense making. I think just being in this room, we are the survivors of a pandemic. We're the ones who made it. And then there might be another one. There's nothing that says that was a once in 100 years situation. In fact, it's not over. So from your respective seats, if a pandemic that requires the kind of quarantine and shutdown happens next week, what would you be thinking about? What would you be worried about vis-a-vis the movement economies from the groups that you're representing, what are the vulnerabilities? And how resilient is our movement economies?
Do you want to talk about workers first?
I mean, I think that in our experience, clearly those that are left working and actually sharing the food and taking all are low wage workers. They have no protections. So that's where my mind goes. And that's our main job at the Ford Foundation. As the future workers actually work with those organizations that are working on the front lines of these issues and ensuring that they build the power to ensure that they actually can protect themselves, right? Through policy, through actual negotiation, again, with any type of corporation, and ensuring that they actually have the cash. They're going to need the cash. And that cash is not only helpful for workers at the moment, but also help them actually to organize each other. Because then that organization is a center of gravity, right? It's mutual aid. It provided like dollars when I most need it. So it's not, so when I think about mutual aid and I think about those cash transfers, I think it's a great way of organizing, right? Also. Yeah. So how do we turn that around and make it an organizing moment, right? And I think it's not that what I do, it's that what our groups on the ground actually does best. And I think I will leave it there. I think that's what I will pay most of our attention to during that time. Who wanna go?
Yeah, I think so first of all, if it was next week, what I would be thinking is, oh shit. But it's very much on our minds, right? Very, very much. And in fact, a lot of this, we call it rooting solidarity economy, like leveraging a CLT model to build local solidarity economy ecosystems, very much informed by climate change, the global supply chain breakdowns of the pandemic, as well as the rightward shift, the fascist uprising that is pretty scary. Like, who knows what kind of local resilience you will need, right? If things really go bad, right? Like scary times. And so how do we think about that local self-provisioning, right? That we have businesses, we produce things that are short of, like, communities are collectively making stuff, right? That they need to survive, the basics, right? That we capture that know-how and that cutting edge digital fabrication stuff as well, right? So, that is really important. We're engaged in that right now. There are lots of lessons, but putting it together and connecting up the knowledge, like, we know how to do regenerative agriculture, we know how to do affordable housing, we know, right? But putting it all together so that it functions as an oasis that is resilient, like, I think that is the work.
I only have one piece to add to that, which is around, there is a thing, it's not just movement culture, there's a thing about culture, I think especially in the US, but in the West generally, where it's like we identify a fact and we respond to it. Like, a thing needs to happen, it needs to be real, and we respond to it. And what I appreciate about your question is that, sure, it's speculative, but what matters is our thought process about, like, what is our capacity to build out more anticipatory kind of frameworks? Because you don't know exactly the way the thing's going to hit, and then it's a fact, and we only validate facts. There is something that needs to be validated around resilience and our practice, the thought experiments, the scenarios, to play in a space and be like, well, what happens if this thing gets politicized in a certain way? So it's not just the fact of a, speculative pandemic, or the one we have now, and like, what if there's a variant that goes in whatever direction? But how do we build out into these kind of anticipatory behaviors? How do we have space for play over things that are dead serious? And that's exactly what this work is. I just completed a fellowship with the Institute for the Future, which is like entirely what they do. And they talk about dead serious. I mean, they spun out of the Rand Corporation. Their clients are like literally the Pentagon, and also like Procter and Gamble and Nike and the governments of Nicaragua. I mean, this is very serious stuff. But they build these questions out in a very methodical and rigorous way, where sometimes it's like a binary. Are we living in a world where there's high or low social cohesion? Is that true nationally or also locally, right? Like, can you have local solidarity with low social cohesion generally, and playing in all these different worlds. Well, what happens if there's strong labor power and low, food security, whatever the different things are, and then being in that world and thinking, well, what do we do in this scenario? How does that inform the kind of organizing we need to do now? So knowing that, if it was next week, what kind of slippage has happened since 2020, and what are the things that we can get ahead of and fight for, in spite of the fact that they might get politicized? How do we get ahead of that before it becomes toxic? I'll tell you right now, something happens next week, there is not going to be we universally are shut in and locked down. Like, the level of resistance now, which is why I laughed. I was like, well, if that happened in 12 years, there's a maybe there. If that happened next week, there is no lockdown. Are you kidding? Like, it would look like, what was that, March or maybe April, where people went with their guns. Like, that took 6 weeks to get there. If there was an announced lockdown or like announcements from the WHO or whatever next week, it would not take 6 weeks. The moment that was announced, people with social media, etc., would organize and they would be out in the streets in certain places, not universally. So I think the lesson there is, yes, validation for any speculative question, that there's always a kernel that informs our action and the ways that we build our power and think through strategy, and even stress test how ready are we for different things. Like, how much better to be, what is the phrase that our mentor said from Institute for the Future, that it's better to be something like, it's better to be laughed at or wrong about a scenario than blindsided by reality or something like that. But just how important it is to use that muscle of play in the very, very dire work of what we do. So thank you.
And I think I'll add something on this question. I think one of the lessons is that from the pandemic is that resilience is actually not just a phrase, but actually important. Local supply chains and that kind of thing. And resilience also, I'm going to get very wonky here, but resilience also affects government. So some of you may recall the Paycheck Protection Program. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. It was an absolutely inefficient system that nobody else used. What did other people do? Well, they did something. They used a system that you might have heard of in the United States called Social Security to pay people directly. That's what they did in Canada. That's what they did in Germany. That's what they did in Great Britain, right? These were liberal governments, conservative governments, social democratic governments. It didn't matter. They had the infrastructure. Theoretically, the reason why the United States didn't do that was because the systems, our computer systems, couldn't talk to each other. And so they did these loans that you had to apply for, and there was, favoritism and, structural racism, what have you. That's not necessary. But if we don't actually build the systems within to be able to get cash to people directly through the payroll system, then we're going to be in the same boat next time. And we don't have to be. So that's just one, as I said, very wonky thing. But we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that were spent poorly as a result.
Can I add something as well, Steve? Yeah, I'm really interested in this question, and thank you so much for asking it. I just wanted to dovetail on something Esteban said. Two things. One, which is like something MPQ is doing that I'm actually really excited about, because I think my background is sort of in studying fiction, and I think that that is the realm that we have to sort of world build and imagine different societies with different levels of interaction and different possibilities, and no one wants to read anymore. So, but very excitingly at MPQ on our climate desk, we had a call for short stories about the climate, and our inbox was flooded with people who are trying to do exactly this work, right? To take a fictional world and to build into it some kind of it's not, the sun is not going to burn out and everything's not going to die all at once. It's going to happen unevenly. It's going to happen to some people more than others. It's going to feel differently. And so I think fiction and sort of narrative play is a really, really important part of doing that work and learning how to imagine those stories. And I think it's a faculty that we've lost a lot as a society in general, is the ability to tell those stories and read them and distribute them on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I wanted to sort of like tell a retrospective story about the pandemic that I sort of drew through lines with in terms of worker movements, which is if you looked back in 2020, the deadliest job in the world, or the deadliest job in the country was a line cook. So you were most likely to die in this country of COVID if you were a line cook. That meant that during the Great Resignation and the Great Awakening, as Erica Smiley calls it in the magazine, millions and millions and millions of people in the restaurant industry quit their jobs, right? Because that they either saw other restaurants turning their back on workers and saying, we'll fire you when we don't need you, and then will you please come back to work when we're open again? We're not gonna offer you protection, we're not gonna offer you anything like that. And they said, go to hell, we're not coming back. I don't think it's a coincidence now that Chicago and DC have abolished the sub-minimum tipped wage, right? Because it's finally there has been a sort of social understanding and an organizing level of sort of, like a narrative of you didn't, during this pandemic, this was the deadliest thing to do. People either left their jobs or they organized, they, Unite Here definitely took some big wins to go and talk to people and try to organize them. And then now policy is actually able to change so that people, don't have to live in poverty to do these incredibly risky jobs, right? Which are not respected in the economy, even though they're one of the things that are the most dependent on it. So I just wanted to add that.
There's a question over here.
Oh.
Hey, Al. I heard each of you talk about storytelling or about media or about journalism or any kind of form, culture, any of these things. And I really appreciate the framing of discursive power. That feels like something that holds all of that and more. But I'm curious, as y'all consider discursive power, what you imagine as a just transition for discursive power, and or like what you imagine as a just transition for journalism, in a way that moves our economies and our movements and our communities forward.
I'm ready, but if someone else for you. Well, I think first of all, it is about respecting the labor power of journalists first and foremost, right? Like we're seeing journalists organize, and then often the media outlet will shut down so that they get rid of everyone and pop up in another place. So part of the power and shift I want to see is more of this Biden appointed and the LRB that is really, for the first time literally in my life, and I'm older than I look, that to really see some teeth finally, to be like, you can't just be labor, you can't be union busting all over the place. And like, what does it look like to have someone in your course? So that, I'm excited for more of that, if we can get more of that. And I think secondly, it is about, there's an organization actually in Philadelphia where I live that is now called the Movement Alliance Project, used to be called the Media Mobilizing Project. And their slogan was, movements begin with the telling of untold stories. And it actually started as a community-based media project of like handing video cameras, which was a novel thing 20 years ago, to frontline communities in Philadelphia to be the authors of their own story, to be the directors, to be the cinematographers, like what is happening on the ground? What is your story of labor struggle, of tenants, of evictions, of single motherhood, of gun violence? And how does that then become the opening salvo of what leads to a political campaign of what we need to do to fix our schools or to fix our relationship with policing or whatever the thing is. So I think some of it is around like, again, democracy, like how we're democratizing things, but coupling that with collective power. So again, not this like individualized, like everyone be your own creative, unique artist, freelancer, but like what does it look like to actually come together and build collective power discursively? And then like we're just tired, and I think José had said this maybe like half an hour ago, but things are changing. Like we are living through a realignment, and it's hard it's just hard to have that awareness and perspective of like just how different, just how malleable the moment we're currently in is. But we are in one of those moments, and that was not true 20 years ago as much as I wished it was. And so it does mean that we can move narrative, we can move political ambitions, we can move the people's beliefs and where they stand when you poll them, focus groups, whatever, through some of this discursive work. Look what happened with marriage equality. Look at what's happening with cannabis, not just for medical reasons, but at this point, just recreational. Look what's happening with whatever's happening with Ukraine. Like that, there's different kinds of conversations and relationships to even something like democratic socialism that 20 years ago would have been like, what are you talking about? This like Congressman Bernie Sanders, and now. Just look at the splash that has made, and we have delegations of Congress people going down to visit leftist administrations in South America. So that all happens through AOC live streaming and through just even the idea of we're in the hopefully our next annual Striketober. So all of those things kind of come from how are we telling the story through small myths or messages. I mean, maybe hashtags is the thing like Striketober, but usually they need to be something that's dense enough to unspool into something where people can understand who are the protagonists in their lives, who are the other characters. Sometimes that does include, who are the villains, who are the targets. But I think all of that hopefully kind of illustrates a bit of what becomes possible through media, narrative, and storytelling. Again, I do not claim to be an expert in this stuff.
I'm going to
I'll
skip
add
that
a
one.
little.
Yeah.
I'll add a little. Thing. So I wasn't sure if what you meant by just transition was about climate change. That's usually how I've heard it, but I'm just gonna follow Esteban's lead and just talk instead about media in general and communication and narrative. It's been really interesting talking to my son who's 25 and where he gets his information from.
TikTok.
Well, no, he doesn't do TikTok, but he does do Reddit and he does these video essays. And sometimes they're like video essays about gaming.
Sure.
And there are a few that really bring in political and economic analysis and philosophy. And I totally poo-poo for so many years, especially when he was younger. I totally poo-pooed it all, anime and gaming, and like you shouldn't spend so much time, and that whole thing. And it's taken me a long time to come around. Like there is really a lot of power, and he makes the argument that this is where young people are getting radicalized.
That's right.
Because like, that's mind-blowing to me. So. Yeah, and then on the opposite end, like where are people getting radicalized in the other direction, and that silo and how they can completely block out any kind of, pesky facts. Yeah, it's very disturbing. So it's a whole new world. Yeah, it's just interesting.
If you go. I guess I should go. It's a media question. I would say, there's the local news or the old-fashioned local news is dying, and that's an opportunity in some ways. So there is an opportunity to build a different media system that's more responsive to communities. We just had an article a few months ago by John Duda from Real News Network. We talked about movement journalism, and DQ, I suppose, is part of that as well, right? But, and finding the way, so we need to build, the economic model so that's sustainable. But I think that's possible. NPR is a mixed bag, let's just say. But I do recall when NPR was like a bit player, and now of course they have like this huge audience, right? More than ABC, NBC, and CBS combined, right? And so I think it's possible to build a media sector economically that is responsive to and financed by ordinary communities and movements, and that's something I think worth fighting for.
And maybe step one being that like the major media companies in the country weren't owned by like the three richest people. That would be a good start. The Washington Post should be owned by Jeff Bezos or Twitter by us. Anyway.
Maybe one more question, then I think we need to wrap up. Probably.
I think we're done.
Oh, is that
I have
okay?
one more question.
Oh yeah.
So,
All right.
just on the last point, I think it was ProPublica that won a Pulitzer. So there's hope for nonprofit media. So NPQ, it's your turn next.
No pressure, right?
Emily, I was really, my heart, sung when you talked about land. I think at Surdna Foundation, a lot of us think about land as a key ingredient to reparations or a pathway, as a component of solidarity economics and, part of movement economies. And, I have an annoying question, which is, how can we, and I'm thinking about foundations and the role that we're in, how can we generate more interest in land justice, in ownership and control, in community ownership and control, BIPOC ownership and control of land? And this is not just a hypothetical question. We have a land use and community power strategy that Don oversees and manages. I used to work at a foundation that phased out a land justice program, Jose. I'm only saying
I'm not
this
responsible.
because
I work there.
I can say this, but it's frustrating because it feels like foundations funders have gotten out of the land and housing justice field in great numbers, and I wonder, how can we launch an effort to try to make that more compelling and make it part of the solution set?
I'll take a crack at that. Maybe the timing was wrong, because what I see is that there's a lot of organizations, like grassroots organizations, community organizing, that used to really be in resist mode. They would turn people, it was a mass base, turn out your people, you protest, right? And now they're embracing the build, right? And a lot of them are seeing land as key. We need a place to stand on. We need a place to build our analysis, to learn, to exchange. But we also need a place to build these institutions, right? And from that ownership grows power. So it's another way of building power, in addition to sort of the mass organizing. I really feel like it's a moment where a lot of these organizations are moving in that direction. So maybe try to resuscitate those programs. And it will be really fascinating to have that conversation with funders.
I would chime in just because I think that the work, honestly, that you all did, I think it was refreshing in the land and housing. And I think that for the longest time we have treated land as a market commodity. Yeah. And philanthropy had thought about it that way. So it's about the transaction, right? But we haven't had a more vision. The communities does, as she was talking about, a visionary way of looking at land. I think philanthropy have not got there. And I think understanding, I think we need some brave souls like Surdna to actually start. Exposing the work of thinking about land much more broadly. Not only as a market commodity, as a place where people live, as a place to increase security, as they're localizing economies, right? I will just say, not us, the sister program, the U.S. Housing Fund is, not huge, but the amount of energy that little dollars actually did to actually animate huge campaigns that was not only about rent control, but it was around, land banks and old land trusts and all these different ways that people were thinking about it. I think that the energy's there. I think philanthropy actually have to just get with the program, and I think it's our job and finding the right. But about this, I don't have to tell you. But I think that's what I see as the main issue.
Well, I have a last word to say after you about philanthropy, but I'm just thinking about how long it took for philanthropy to catch up to fund operating costs, invest in people's administration. How basic. So even the idea, I think maybe even more so in the arts world, but additionally in the economic justice space, just the idea of like resilience comes from having an asset. Like, why wouldn't you want that to be the thing that you're resourcing, which is own your building. Oh, you're an arts space. Oh, like, oh, you're growing food. Oh, you want to do youth programming. Like, what about helping to purchase that vacant lot in the community that, like, underwrite that? And it's what could be more productive than investing in an asset rather than just the cash gift. You have to show that it went toward this payroll and that program and the stipends and the money's out the door and that's the end of it. But, you know, to have some asset to lean on, to leverage, that you can then go to a CDFI and say, hey, can we borrow against the land that we now own in order to do yada, yada, yada. So I think it's everything that Emily said, and I think it's even more than that. We had an opportunity when Arts Place America was winding down. I was facilitating a process among arts organizations in Philadelphia. And of course, their immediate disposition was, okay, we're getting what? $2 million or something. Well, let's just divide it up equally and we'll all run our programs. And the amount of political education, it didn't take much, but within the first 2 sessions of convincing people, you could use that money to just buy the existing spaces, preserve them, and those become a home for all of the arts work that you're doing. That becomes an asset. You could then go to the bank and say, give us $500,000. We have a building that's worth $2 million. And the way that their minds, they were like, oh, we were thinking very differently. So when we're talking about power, yes, it's labor power, but it's also the economic power that comes of actually owning anything, having assets, whether that's housing, land, lots, gardens, and retreat centers and things like that.
I'll say a couple quick things. We're doing a series right now on Asian Pacific Americans, and it's all about land and control over land. We did a series earlier this year on Latino communities, again, all about land and control over land. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the land back movement in Native America, right? So there's a lot of energy out there. There's also an article in the magazine by Rudy Espinosa about commercial ownership of real estate. It's an excellent article, but land's hugely important, and I don't think movement folks are confused about it. I won't pretend to know what will persuade philanthropy to be interested in it, but I think the energy is definitely there from the movement side. So, thanks for the question. Really good question. Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to say, in the upcoming issue, the fall issue that's coming out in a few weeks, maybe in 2 weeks, the opening article is about the movement in Maine, the National Conservancy there, which owns the most land out of any of the states. In collaboration with the foundations in Maine and the native tribes in Maine, the government have all begun, I think, the most advanced land back movement, which is not just giving back land, but also giving access to land that they can't give back, and creating a fund. All the foundations in Maine, which there are many, many more than you expect, are giving to this pool of money so they can run it. It's just an amazing story of how one state is doing it. I think replicated.
Thanks. Well, I do think I want to. I'll pass it back to Don in case you have any last words or.
No.
I do want to thank Surdna Foundation and our panelists, Emily Kawano, José Garcia, Esteban, for your contributions, Rithika for my colleague for her excellent introduction, and thanks so much for coming. And please do make sure to take a copy of the magazine, and we'll be in touch. And with that, I'll pass it to Don.
Okay. All right. Well, it's an honor to host all of you here. This is such a great conversation. I'm getting on a flight in a few minutes, so in an hour and a half. So I'm gonna take my copy with me. I want to thank you guys for filming this and recording it. Also want to thank you for making us feel happy and comfortable with beverages, and also Geraldine for being here to make sure everything's running smoothly. And the last thing I'll say is that like many of you were saying, when I started out in the field, solidarity economics was and I love this term, movement economies, was a really, it was a nascent term, not well defined. now it feels very robust. Like I love Manuel Pastor Chris Banner's book. There's a ton of stuff happening, lots of energy, and happy to contribute to harnessing that energy into real action. So thank you for being here. And we still have food, beverages. I think we can stay here for a little while. Oh, till late. Okay, 5 minutes.
Bye.